This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hey everyone, Jody Avergan here. Welcome to our series that we are calling Some Sunday Context, original conversations and favorites from the archives that may help give some historical context to the very rocky history we're living through right now in 2025. Today, a story about surveillance and deportation threats of a prominent activist. Here in 2025, we saw this week the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University student who is one of the leaders of the pro-Palestinian protests that have taken place on that campus over the last year. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement officers arrested Khalil last Saturday, took him to a detention center in New Jersey, then to one in Louisiana, where he remains. For a while, no one knew his location, not his lawyers, not his colleagues, not his 8 months pregnant wife. One of the more chilling parts of this case is that everyone seems to acknowledge that Khalil is being targeted for his political beliefs. The Trump administration's own justification for revoking his green card and putting him into custody is that he organized protest and espoused anti-Israel beliefs. Regardless of your stance on the war in Gaza, the right to protest, the right to free speech, it's kind of right there in the First Amendment. But that doesn't necessarily protect you from surveillance and detention and targeting. And the slope here is very, very slippery, which is why I think so many people of conscience are concerned and protesting over Khalil's arrest. All of this made me think of a story we did a couple years ago about another prominent activist who was targeted for surveillance and threatened with deportation, John Lennon. The parallels aren't exact, but it is worth listening to this episode about how John Lennon was targeted by the FBI for his political speech, faced trumped-up charges, and just the enormous pressure that he faced. And I should add, all while trying to start a family here in the United States. And the larger context of what life was like in the early 70s for activists on the left, there are lots of parallels there. So here it is, our chat from 2021 about John Lennon, deportation threats, and a little bit about the Beatles themselves, all with one of our favorite guests, Some Sunday Context. Take a listen, and we will be back with a brand new episode on Tuesday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, October 24th, 1973, former Beatles singer John Lennon sues the U.S. government, demanding that it admit or deny whether Mr. Lennon or his lawyer Leon Wildes had been the subjects of illegal wiretaps or surveillance. I will spoil it for you a bit and say that eventually they learned and we learned that, well, maybe there wasn't technically any illegal wiretapping of Lennon going on, but there was a ton of surveillance and monitoring, a big FBI file on Lennon, attempts to deport him and mitigate his influence, and all sorts of FBI-related shenanigans. So let's dive inside John Lennon's FBI file because it is full of fascinating tidbits, and I also think helps us reframe his politics and his activism and his legacy a little bit. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode, someone we've been trying to have on the show for a long time, a Radiotopia stalwart and compatriot, Hrishikesh Hirway is here, song exploder. You have some new music of your own coming out that features Yo-Yo Ma. You just did a TED Talk. Rishi, you're having a moment.
Thanks for having me. This is definitely the peak of all of the things.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you know you've made it. You've climbed to the mountain. You've pushed the boulder all the way up the hill when you've come on our show. But specifically, right, we like to just have friends with smart things to say to come on regardless. But a recent song exploder is with John Lennon. And I think this is the first one you've done where obviously it's featuring someone and breaking down a song by someone who is no longer alive, but you got access to his archives and were able to piece it together in a really kind of beautiful, masterful way. But you got any thoughts about sort of what it was like to commune with John Lennon on tape?
It was wild. You know, I think sometimes people think that because I make Song Exploder that I have some extensive musical knowledge, like that I'm a music historian myself, but I am not. And and then there are people who are fanatical about the Beatles.
Yes.
And while I am a fan, I can't compare to the people who just know their catalog and their history inside and out. So this was really nice for me because I actually still got to learn a lot of things the way that I do when I do have an interview with somebody that's alive and making music. When I get to have those interviews, the most exciting part for me is learning stuff about their story.
Yeah.
And I can imagine for somebody who's a Beatles expert, they're like, well, we already know all this stuff and I'm just collecting things that I already know. But I really enjoyed it because I felt like, yeah, I did get to hear him say some of these things and express some of these ideas for me for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just described what it's like. I think when sometimes we get notes from people who are historians who listen to the show, and we happen to do an episode about their specific area of expertise, and they're like, "Well, you missed these 19 things." It's like, well, yes. But and the first thing you said to me when I reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to do this?" You were like, "Well, yeah, but just so you know, Beatles fans are pretty intense." And yeah, so yes. I am a big fan of the Beatles, but by no means encyclopedic, and I'm sure we will not cover everything here. But I will say, your piece, the song you cover, is from when John Lennon just went solo. This story here about when John Lennon is trying to say, hey, what's going on with my FBI surveillance, is right around the same time. And it's this interesting moment, the end of the 60s into the early 70s. Lennon is in America, trying to make a life in America. So let's put that into context before we get to what's in the actual file. Niki, as you see it, what is going on with John Lennon's life in the United States that he's trying to build, and what are the sort of pressures that he's feeling?
I mean, certainly going solo was a big thing, right? He's rebooting, in a way, his career, taking it in a different direction. He's disappointing a lot of former fans and building a new base and experimenting with new styles of music. But he's also becoming an activist. He's engaging in bed-ins, which is where he and Yoko Ono stay in bed all day in protest of the war. He's connecting with radicals and with anti-war activists who are also looking for ways to use their platforms to do something about the Vietnam War. And by 1972, when there's an election coming, that's something that they're focused on, and it is something that the Nixon administration is also focused on.
And I think it's really important to talk about sort of Lennon's career in connection to like political activism in the political environment, because this is also a moment where for the first time 18-year-olds are about to vote now. And so if you can imagine, his fan base is mostly teenagers, young adults, people in their 20s. This is a moment where they literally get to be influenced in a way that I think a lot of people are nervous about, how 18-year-olds are going to make their votes count in a particular direction. And I think Lennon has a lot of sway with his voice.
And 18-year-olds who have the vote, again, because of the Vietnam War. That was the big winning argument, that if you're old enough to die for your country, you're old enough to vote. So the Vietnam War is just shooting through all of these different parts of culture and politics, and they're sort of focusing all in 1972 around the election.
I'm reading a book about the history of Rolling Stone magazine right now, and it's amazing how much that change in the voting age is such a central factor and all that. I don't think I'd really had my head around it, but with it, in the case of Rolling Stone, it was just like, oh, now here's a magazine that is speaking to people who now have political power. Like, there's all these people who thought, oh, there's real cultural cachet here, but now all of a sudden there's a real political force. We got to pay attention. And it's just that felt like the center of gravity around all the conversations in a way I hadn't really appreciated.
John Lennon's song that is in the Song Exploder episode is called God, and it is about him losing his faith in the idea of these sort of like mythological institutions, and kind of debunking them. It includes the Beatles. He says, I don't believe in Beatles, but he says, I don't believe in Elvis. I don't believe in Buddha. He's really taking apart the idea of the power of myth. And I think that's also really scary for people who are in power.
So what is your sense then when we think of John Lennon as a political actor? It's weird. I almost think of some of the conversations we've had about MLK, about how there's this sanitized version of MLK. I have a dream, and then people just stop paying attention after that line. And, with John Lennon, it's like, imagine, right? And then it's just people stop. Whereas if you really dig a little deeper, there's some actual radicalism there. He actually, I think, has sometimes said, basically, I think jokingly, but he kind of said, like, imagine is sort of like the Communist Manifesto if you actually look at the lyrics, and think about what it's actually saying, as opposed to this platitude.
I figured the FBI was mostly interested in him as a communist, since his name is Lennon.
Look, there's no coincidence out there.
One typo. Just set off the whole thing.
Poor guy.
Not a very good disguise, John Lennon.
I know.
But I guess from the FBI's perspective, right? Should we say, if the FBI decides that you are worthy of a big file, that means that they're taking you seriously, or is it, heck, the FBI at this stage is just going to kind of like keep a file on anyone?
I mean, they do have files on lots and lots of people. It's a massive organization by the 1960s and 1970s. And there were a lot of activists in the U.S. We know that many, not all, but many civil rights activists were under FBI surveillance and CIA surveillance, which becomes a big issue later on. This is also the case for John Lennon. They have a lot of power. And they're, especially J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, is a very suspicious, if not paranoid man. Richard Nixon is a very suspicious and definitely paranoid man. And so there are probably FBI files on the most innocuous people, but John Lennon was an actual activist and of the type that they would be collecting files on and using government power against.
He fits perfect within the playbook. I mean, if you're thinking about the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, this is, I would say, maybe the height of the Black Panther Party as well, or at least getting towards its climax, and then also the height of like anti-war activism and protest. He really does fit right within that moment, and it almost makes sense for him to have a file, given that all that we know about the FBI. Like, I would be shocked if he didn't. But I think knowing all of this is like, that's about right.
There is this sort of like badge of honor thing that happens, I think, for a lot of people. It's like you haven't made it until the FBI has a file on you.
Yeah, I think the more scandalous thing is not that the FBI had a file on him, although certainly they were doing illegal domestic surveillance. It's something that would come out. We've mentioned the Church Commission a few times on here, but it will come out in the Church Commission that they're doing this illegal spying, but that the government actually takes action against him, right? That there's this deportation order that is issued in order to get him to stop organizing and in order to get him to stop being an activist. That works, right? That it keeps him from being as public in his activism and as political in his public persona, because the government really holds this very real power over his life.
Was it generally understood by everybody that this deportation order was trumped up? That it was based on these marijuana charges in the UK? It seems like so flimsy from my perspective now, but I'm wondering, like, did it seem flimsy to everybody even then?
I think it depends on what your politics were. Lennon talked all the time about the fact that everybody else had these charges too, and they weren't facing any sort of repercussions for them, and that he was being specifically targeted. But if you were one of those people who were voting for Nixon and believed that rock and roll music and drugs were this giant threat to the United States, you might think, okay, well, he is being targeted, but being targeted fairly.
Before we get going with today's show, I want to give a shout out to another show in the Radiotopia family, Radio Diaries. For over 25 years, Radio Diaries has been creating sound-rich personal stories on history and beyond, and now they have a new mini-series. It's called Making Waves. This series is right up my alley. It is stories about 3 controversial broadcasters in American history, who each used their microphone in different ways. One to warn, one to rile, and one to preach. And today, they are largely forgotten. There's a black preacher who reached millions on the airwaves before the civil rights movement, a woman who tried to warn the public of Hitler's rising power, and the talk show host who first proved that outrage sells.
Sometimes we get people on there who disagreed with him and would fight with him. Actually, he liked that.
I mean, if you were a Broadway play, you'd be a flop.
I'm not a Broadway play.
But you're a flop.
You can listen to all 3 episodes of Making Waves on the Radio Diaries podcast and find out lots more at radiodiaries.org. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Let's take a moment to talk about your wireless bill. Maybe you, like me, take a look at that bill every month and get a little shudder that goes down your spine, and you ask yourself, how can it cost so much to get wireless service? But guess what? It really doesn't have to be that way. You can say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan's jaw-dropping monthly bills and unexpected overages because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans that start at $15 a month. All of their plans come with high-speed data, unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone, you can transfer over. I made the switch from one of the major carriers recently. It was incredibly seamless. And just like that, it was like, I really didn't have to be paying that much all these years. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is here for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Upfront payments of $45 for 3-month 5 GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode is brought to you by Quince. Folks, it is officially time to start thinking about refreshing your wardrobe for the spring. Maybe even leveling up with a little affordable luxury. Well, Quince is here to help. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices within reach. I'll tell you the section of Quince that I'm most excited about, which might tell you something about where my head's at. There's a section on the site called The Vacation Shop. I just ordered a new pair of sunglasses from there. They have an Italian leather sling for under $100, hats, cases, even luggage if you want. I have made a vow to travel in linen and only linen, so I've stocked up on a couple European utility shirts, $45. That's it. And a new pair of nice-looking board shorts, $40. So I am all set for my summer travels. If you've got your eye on all the fun that comes with warm weather, go ahead and give Quince a shot. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping, 365-day returns, quince.com/thisday.
It's interesting, too, because this is, we've talked about the FBI and sort of their interference in a lot of people's lives and these like trumped up charges when I think we were talking about this in a Marcus Garvey episode where it was like mail fraud or something like that. Like these aren't really, egregious acts that are being done, but it doesn't matter. I think all they need is like just a little bit of a nugget. And it's interesting how the go-to is always to tackle someone's mobility, someone's ability to be able to move within the country, come into the country or leave the country. That's something that happens with Paul Robeson. It's something that happens with Garvey. It's also something that happens with Du Bois and other Black activist leaders. We talked about this with Charlie Chaplin earlier. Yeah. That mobility really does become politicized. And if you can sort of stop someone from moving, maybe you can also stop the movement. And I think that's something we see over and over again.
Which also, Rishi, I think there's this interesting moment now where I think for a number of reasons, maybe people are starting to rethink this post-end of Beatles moment. And I think, the eternal question of, did John Lennon break up the Beatles? Did Yoko Ono break up the Beatles? What was that dynamic like? And just adding this like deportation threat on top of a person who's in this country trying to reinvent themselves creatively, deeply in love with someone and trying to start a new chapter, and then this like oppressive threat. I mean, I think it really does start to make us rethink what those years were like. Yeah.
The thing that strikes me about the deportation order and like hampering people's mobility is it's like a workaround for an actual arrest. It effectively does a lot of the things that an arrest does, but it doesn't have the sort of stigma. And for people who potentially could easily become martyrs if they were arrested or worse, it kind of avoids that for the government while still getting them out of the picture.
Ono and Lennon respond to this stuff in, I think, a very... in perhaps the way you would expect. Both, I think they're very upfront about how awful this is, this pressure is. But then they also, I think at one point, this is in 73, they have a press conference where they announce that there's a new country called Newtopia, which is a conceptual country with, quote, no land, no boundaries, no passports, only people, but that is where they're going to declare citizenship, thus nullifying the deportation threat or something. But, they push back in their way.
It's such a good art rock move. I love it. The only requirement for citizenship is declaring you're a citizen, and so anybody was allowed to be an ambassador, and therefore you get diplomatic immunity.
I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
You just need to get the government of the United States to recognize Newtopia, and you are set.
Diplomatic recognition, no big deal.
Yeah.
Oh man, maybe you should change the intro for this episode to "Welcome to this day in esoteric political history from Newtopia." My name is Jody.
There you go. You look at some of the activism that Lennon is taking here, and I just want to come back to this question of the kind of like range of activism that Lennon is taking. I mean, he's holding rallies and he does meet with like sort of more frontline activists, but he's also doing stuff like bed-ins, and this is the time, and you get into this a little in your episode, Rishi, where he's getting into primal scream therapy?
Primal therapy.
Primal therapy, So I'm just curious, kind of like the mix of the political and the personal. And sort of what seems to be like a genuine quest to evolve as a human being at the same time that he's trying to engage in some way with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, he was definitely disillusioned with the idea of being like a teen idol. He was 30 years old in the archival footage that I was working with for the episode. So just a few years before he files suit. This is when he's 33, this day in political history. But the thing that struck me really was like, just listening to his voice, you could hear how fed up he was with a lot of things. I wouldn't say that he was cynical, but he sounds disillusioned.
I think that's important, and it's part of the reason why most likely he's talking to these activists who are on the more radical edge of the New Left and trying to come up with solutions for how you change things. And I think that his disillusionment is going to be fed by the fact that things don't change that much. But in 1972, he's talking with Abby Hoffman and Bobby Seale, and he's talking about putting together this sort of like concert series that follows wherever Richard Nixon goes in the campaign trail in order to have an anti-Nixon, anti-war concert to draw people out, register them to vote. And it's because of this that the Nixon administration issues that deportation order. They don't want him to engage in this kind of activism. So here he is trying to do something, and he's immediately thwarted by this government that's far more powerful than anything he's really able to tackle.
It's interesting too, because all of the 1970s, it's like the decade of disillusionment. I mean, everyone starts to sort of no longer believe in just war, or no longer believe in political campaigns or presidential authority. I mean, this really becomes a decade of questioning authority and questioning the status quo and norms. And so he kind of also fits right within that moment of questioning what like success and fame looks like for him, alongside all of these other political things that are happening, I think, that are fueling each other.
Yeah, his lyric actually got him into trouble. There was some controversy around the first line of the song, which is, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And through the primal therapy that he was doing, there was a lot of questioning about religion and the point of it. There's another thing that this whole investigation by the FBI brings to mind for me, which is the idea of what the actual influence of art is in the world. Because I think it can often feel, certainly like in from my perspective, like putting out songs, you're just like, well, this doesn't matter to anybody. Like, this is just self-indulgent. I'm just doing this thing for the sake of my own soul and nothing else. But when you have somebody at the scale of John Lennon saying something like God is a concept by which we measure our pain, and you have somebody like Nixon in power and all the people who look up to Nixon, that becomes a real threat, I think. In some ways, it's kind of exciting to me, the idea that like somebody who's, yes, he's meeting with Bobby Seale, and yes, he's engaged in actual activism, but I don't think that it's just those acts that's getting him an FBI file. It's the fact that he's writing these songs, he's making these statements, he's doing these works as an artist that's making him a target as well. And I don't know if this is the wrong takeaway from it, but there's something exciting about it, I think. Yeah. It makes me feel affirmed. That gives me some affirmation in the power of art. Yes,
that art has utility, that art does work, that art has the ability to communicate political and social messages, and that it's not just this superficial thing that people dance to. It's something that you could vote by, you can have a consciousness attached to it.
Yeah, that it could actually be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And destabilizing in the way that the pillars of Nixon's America were the Christian right and patriotism and the military and faith in institutions. And Lennon attacks those pillars again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest fear, whether conscious or not, from someone like Nixon, is not, oh, this celebrity is going to tell his followers to vote against me, but more like this celebrity is going to rewire a bunch of people's brains and their fundamental notion of, who to trust. And then someone else is going to come in and sort of point that in a political direction or whatever. But yeah, that's the real power. A couple other tidbits here. Well, first off, I do have to say, we've talked a lot about how this fits into the FBI playbook, and I just want to acknowledge that imagine you're an FBI agent. There's two of you, and you walk into the office, and your commanding officer or whatever says, "Okay, you're going to go infiltrate the Black Panthers or the Weather Underground, and you're going to come up with some plots to bomb the Capitol or whatever, and then you're going to report back to us. And you over here, agent number 2, you're going to go just follow John Lennon around and go to some concerts, maybe go to a bed-in, check that out,
Sign me up.
Seriously,
infiltration can take different forms. Exactly. You're gonna.
How good of a drummer are you?
Exactly. But some other tidbits here. I mean, it is worth noting, Strom Thurmond plays a factor here. He was the one who wrote the letter to the Nixon administration saying, "Hey, let's put this guy under surveillance. There's a threat here," and moreover, identified that deportation threat as the real pressure point. And it does sort of come to an end in the summer of 1972, really around this concert that you were talking about, Niki, where it looked like these plans to do this massive tour and this massive concert ahead of the election fell through, and the FBI said, okay, well, maybe that specific threat is not there anymore, so we're going to wind things down a bit. Eventually,
they wind the case down, but the deportation order stays in effect.
Right, exactly. So how does that eventually resolve itself?
Well, so it's he's under a 60-day deportation order, basically for 2 years. His lawyers keep getting it extended. They're making a case because Yoko Ono has a daughter that she's in a custody battle over, and she needs to be in the U.S. to do that. And so to keep their family together, they make the case that they need to stay in the U.S. So this goes all the way to the New York State Supreme Court, which overturns the deportation order in October 1975, notably after Richard Nixon has resigned as president. The entire rest of the time that Nixon is president, this deportation order is in effect to kind of neutralize John Lennon as a political force.
The victory also coincides with the birth of his son, Sean, too.
Yeah. And then he gets his green card in 76, the following year. Which, again, I just think it helps really recast, what do we want to call it, 69 to 75, as this period of here's a person who is just fighting for their right to live in this country and, with someone who, and start a family and all those things, I think are just such important dimensions to the John Lennon story. I want to get your thoughts, Rishi, on sort of other things you've learned about Lennon. I will say that, and I don't know if this is how your Song Exploder came about, but, there's this big documentary coming out from Peter Jackson this fall that goes back into the archives and uncovers all of this footage from the last Beatles recording session, which ended up being Let It Be and was sort of famous in Beatles lore as the moment when the band started to disintegrate. I'm very excited for that documentary. And I've read this guy, Joe Hagan, we should have him on the show. Joe Hagan's a really great writer. He actually wrote this book about Rolling Stone that I'm reading right now, but he saw the film and wrote this piece about how it might really recast some of the lore about how the Beatles broke up, and that you see this, and it was a lot more sort of joyful and casual and not as maybe contentious and just, anyway. But it got me thinking actually about just sort of like, can you rewrite history? Can you unmoor some basic lore, especially about something like how the Beatles broke up? And I think this film will be a really interesting test case in that. Something we think about all the time on this show is like, can you just sort of like shake history up a little bit? And so, Rishi, that's a long and winding way for me to ask you whether there were specific things that you felt like you learned beyond what we've discussed, and where your head is at in terms of kind of like reappreciating and reimagining John Lennon and the Beatles.
Well, the primal therapy stuff was pretty interesting to me. I barely knew anything about it, but how much that played into his songwriting directly. Like it went one for one. There's even a little bit of an excerpt from Janov, the therapist that he and Yoko Ono worked with, the inventor of primal therapy, where he talked about how they had a conversation. He was doing sort of a long treatise on religion and how people turn to it because of this early childhood therapy. And then John Lennon basically takes everything that he says and then transmutes it into just this one line of the song. But it was directly born out of that. I wouldn't say that I was someone who was like, oh, I listen to Imagine and that's the end of my sense of John Lennon. But, but I was somewhere between that and the way I think of him now. He is just sort of more angry and cynical and kind of IDGAF in general at the time of writing that album, the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, than I realized. I also wanted to mention, for a show that's interested in, things that happen on particular dates, the birth of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's son, Sean Ono Lennon, they share the same birthday. They were both born on the same day, which I thought,
wow,
your
listeners might appreciate.
Yeah, makes for a simple raft of celebrations inside a family, I suppose.
Yeah.
One cake. All right. That brings us to the end of the episode. Hrishikesh Hirway, thank you so much for doing this. And you have a TED Talk. You got some new music out. Song Exploder continues. Obviously, Home Cooking, West Wing Weekly, partners, all sorts of wonderful things through Radiotopia. So thank you for joining us. Did I miss anything?
Thank you.
You have a new newsletter. You have a new newsletter.
I have a newsletter.
Even I'm a better plugger than you are.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for letting me sit in on this. You can't see me, but I was in my bed. I was doing a bed in this whole time.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
They're even sort of changing their own rules to get us, just because we're peaceniks, really.
You don't ask because of your anti-war action and not your marijuana conviction, then?
Well, I mean, let's say that a few friends of ours in the pop business have exactly the same conviction as me and are allowed to come and go as free as they like.
Radiotopia.